achieved during sky battles when Skarmory is high up in the air, but when you return back to the ground, the illusion is completely shattered. It has Skarmory 2 feet off the ground in the exact same state, which makes him appear as if he's levitating or hovering as opposed to gliding. Skarmory went from an imposing force to looking very goofy due to being suspended in the air in such a manner, like a puppet dangling from a piece of string. The lack of any noticeable animation or displacement accentuates this issue. Many Pokemon suffered a similar fate. Fast forward 6 years to 2019 in Sword and Shield, Skarmory has been fastened to, and left hanging from, that very same string ever since. Even though sky battles were immediately removed the following generation in Alola. Well, today, I set Skarmory free from the confines of its string prison. Take a look. Isn't that something? Skarmory immediately regains that imposing demeanor it had so long ago by no longer awkwardly floating 2 feet off the ground with no movement. This animation lacks the character and personality achieved by the one in the Genius Sonority games, and the pose isn't dynamic to compensate for the lack of animation. But damn, does it feel good to have Skarmory demand respect once again. Xatu is another Pokemon left horribly mutilated after the Sky Battle tragedy. It went from calm, stoic, and reserved to, well, goofy looking. Xatu has the type of design where even if it flapped its totem pole wings while airborne, it still looks pretty funny regardless. I'm not sure what criteria Game Freak established that determines Sky Battle eligibility, but not all winged flying type Pokemon were. Pidgey, for example, is not eligible, despite it being perfectly capable of partaking. Pidgey's idle animation reflects this as it's grounded as opposed to flying like its evolutions. Xatu should have been in the same boat, but alas, this was not the case. Until today. Xatu has been returned to its natural, composed state, no longer awkwardly left dangling midair. Xatu feels like an entirely new Pokemon, and I'm happy to see her restored to her former glory. Wingull is a weird one. It has always floated, even in the Genius Sonority games, but at least it swayed back and forth as if though it were dancing on the air. It also has a bit of a bounce to it. This is the type of displacement I was referring to earlier that is absent in Game Freak's gliding animations that has the Pokemon come across as tethered or restricted, which is where the string analogy comes from. Wingull has a bit of a sway in Game Freak's games, but it's not nearly as pronounced. Anyway, here's the change I made that brings Wingull down to earth. Wingull having his wings folded like origami is actually really cute. Wingull also seems pretty happy to give his wings a rest for a change. I was able to somewhat address Wingull in the overworld. Instead of levitating slightly above the ground indefinitely and moving around like some kind of artificial drone, this Wingull descends, lands, and ascends before changing direction, which is more reflective of what you would expect from a wild-winged creature in nature. The way Wingull's wings fold and unfold is reminiscent of the Imperial Shuttle from Star Wars, which I found pretty amusing. The remaining featured Pokemon in this video aren't necessarily a fix per se, it more comes down to personal preference. But it's an interesting and exciting look that casts the Pokemon into a different light that challenges your initial perception of them. First up is Charizard. In all of the 3D Pokemon games, he was in a grounded state while idle and would fly around when attacking. This is typically how he's portrayed in the anime as well. Game Freak's Charizard is airborne indefinitely, which essentially removes a state of being that inadvertently detracts from the Pokemon's character. Instead of having both a unique idle and flying animation, they are left with only the latter, which results in less personality being conveyed. I believe that is one of the primary reasons why I prefer the grounded idle animation as opposed to the flying one. A lot of people seem to agree with this sentiment in part simply based off of the reception of my Skydive video. Here is what grounded Charizard looks like in Sword and Shield. A seemingly minor change that can dramatically alter how you perceive the Pokemon. Next up is Flygon. Just like Charizard, Flygon 2 is always grounded when idle in battle. Flygon is a peculiar case as it's a winged Pokemon that is not flying type, but has the ability levitate. Technically, Flygon isn't levitating, but is actually flying. Semantics aside, Flygon was portrayed as flying indefinitely with its wings. Let's put him back on the ground for a minute. This idol overwhelms me with heavy nostalgia. Flygon is one of my favorite Gen 3 Pokemon, and I use it all the time in the old Genius Sonority 3D Pokemon games. So seeing him back in a similar state brings me a warming sense of joy and happiness. Last one will be none other than Corviknight. Corviknight is one of the best designed Pokemon of Gen 8, so I thought it would be fun to gain additional perspective on this great Pokemon. Flying is a specialty of the species, seeing as how it's used as a primary source of transportation for people across the region, thanks to the taxi service that employs it. Here is a concept of Corviknight where its signature flying abilities are conserved until needed. This gives me a greater appreciation of the design itself, and reminds me a lot more of its official art compared to the flying animation. Neat features like the collared wings that are normally obscured by frantic flapping motions are in full display for all to see. Which Corviknight idol do you prefer? Make sure to leave your thoughts down below as I'm curious what you guys think. That's all for now. I got some more exciting stuff on the way, so stay tuned for that. Until next time, thanks for watching. And we're back with some more fixed Pokemon animations in Sword and Shield. First up for today is going to be Starmie, the mysterious one. I first used Starmie as an example in one of my earlier videos to highlight the degree of degradation regarding Pokemon animation quality. Way back in Stadium 1 for the N64, over 20 years ago, Starmie's backstar could be seen spinning in its idle animation. Simple, yet effective and highly memorable animation quirk, seeing as how I've been able to remember it after all this time amongst hundreds of other Pokemon. An animation entirely unique to Starmie that accentuates its already peculiar design. Most Pokemon have typical features which makes them relatable. A face with a pair of eyes, ears, mouth, nose, etc. Starmie lacks all of that, which can make the Pokemon hard to relate to. Many people experienced a similar disconnect concerning the Ultra Beasts. People claim they didn't feel like Pokemon. A large contributor to this is the fair number of them lacking the aforementioned features, among other things. This means that you need to be extra creative with animations to succeed in bringing the monster to life, to bypass the lack of human-esque characteristics, to craft a personality of its own that an audience can be emotionally invested in. Starmie's animation adds a level of charm that would otherwise be impossible due to the limitations present from its design. The animation idea carried over into the Game Freak Pokemon games, starting with Pokemon Crystal. It was also used during Starmie's idle animation for the Gen 5 games. However, come X and Y, this all changed. Starmie was stripped of the charm that was established through its animation in earlier titles for no discernible reason. In Sword and Shield, Starmie appears rather lifeless. This, in conjunction with Starmie's alien-like design, has come across as cold and distant rather than fun and energetic like Starmie of the past. Here is Starmie with its trademark spinning star restored. The star only spins in one direction instead of alternating, but it gets the job done. Starmie is no longer an empty husk void of soul. Some of that lost charm has been returned, breathing new life into a character desperate for air. Next up is the lovable Sudowoodo, the imposter tree that hates water. When the player squirted a tree-like object in gold and silver, it would do a shake and then attack. This shake, as well as the animated sprite in Crystal, is most likely the inspiration behind Sudowoodo's animation in the older 3D Pokemon games. Game Freak Sudowoodo actually has no animation at all. It stands completely still. And I know I'll get a million comments down below saying, but Distant Kingdom, Sudowoodo is pretending to be a tree just like the Pokedex entry says, so of course it's standing completely still. Yeah, I know. A few problems with that though. 1. The dex is referring to Wild Sudowoodo, leading us to 2. The reason the Wild Sudowoodo do that in the first place is to avoid being attacked, which leads us to 3. It makes no sense for a Sudowoodo to masquerade as a tree in the middle of a battle when that camouflage's primary function, to avoid being attacked, is entirely negated by the fact that Sudowoodo is engaged in combat. That defeats the point of the camouflage. I appreciate the appeal to the Pokemon's lore, I really do, but it just doesn't fit given the context of the situation. Therefore, I managed to capture a familiar look. Sudowoodo wiggles again. This animation references the first bit of lore we discussed, which is more appropriate and sensitive for battle, with the added bonus of being a lot more interesting. Before we proceed, I'd like to take another quick look at Wingull. The change I applied to Wingull in my last video was certainly mixed. Some loved it, others not so much. I discovered a new technique that made this video possible, so I wanted to take another stab at Wingull. Wingull is still in the air, but is no longer awkwardly levitating close to the ground. Wingull is certainly more cute in its origami state, but this, I'm sure, is a satisfactory improvement for those that preferred Wingull stay in the air with its wings spread wide. I was always a fan of Maractus, as it's definitely one of my favorite design Pokemon of the 5th generation. Maractus has an animation in Pokedex 3D Pro that perfectly encapsulates the fun, energetic, and lighthearted persona of the Maracta-inspired cactus. Maractus' idle animation in Sword and Shield isn't bad by any means. There's some movement involved that conveys similar personalities to 3D Pro, albeit to a lesser degree. Maractus is more lukewarm and sedated in Sword and Shield, so let's turn up the heat. I feel this captures a comparable level of energy found in 3D Pro that was lost in the
And this start and stop style for fast Pokemon looks really bad.
Use our power to fell a god. Colosseum was tiny.
All of my energy will be released, blasting you and this planet straight to hell! The energy shunted from my body transforms into a propelling force, elevating speed and power to a level beyond the limitations of living flesh!
At Game Freak, we really spent a lot of time thinking about what the best way to move forward was, really preserving the quality of all the different Pokemon, while also, taking into account the battle balance, having so many different Pokemon available.
Dead. Dead. Dead.
to darkness!
Dead.
Turn to darkness!
Dead.
How strong is this thing?
Holy shit.
Likeable and charming is washed away in the end and replaced with nothing that is as endearing or memorable, essentially killing the character. Marnie is the last of the three rivals and is an extremely underwhelming, underdeveloped, and largely inconsequential for the entirety of the game. She doesn't really do anything. This is the rating system that I will be using for this review. There are timestamps down below if you wish to hear me discuss particular aspects of the game. There will also obviously be spoilers. You have been warned. Pokemon Sword and Shield are arguably the most controversial and contentious Pokemon titles ever released. Before I get into the review, I would like to touch on some context surrounding the titles regarding this controversy. I feel this is necessary because it is pertinent information that puts the games into proper perspective. Pokemon was always a beloved handheld classic, but titles such as Colosseum, Gale of Darkness, and Pokemon Battle Revolution showcase what the classic handheld titles were capable of on much more powerful hardware, having the ability to bring the Pocket Monster to life like nothing seen before. That fabled title was to finally arrive under the moniker Sword and Shield, and were technically Game Freak's second attempt at a console Pokemon experience, but we like to pretend that other one doesn't exist. The question that was on everybody's mind was, would they deliver? Not much information was known up until the monumental E3 2018 Treehouse demo, which gave everyone an in-depth look at the upcoming games. What was showcased, however, was a far cry from the concocted childhood dream Pokemon title inspired by the aforementioned console Pokemon games. Despite making a giant leap forward in terms of hardware capabilities, Sword and Shield, at first glance, betrayed that sentiment. It was extremely lackluster, with terrible, muddy textures, stiff and sometimes non-existent animations, bugs, and so on. It was a very disheartening presentation. That was only the beginning. Immediately after the presentation, it was revealed that the National Dex would not make a return. These would be the first games in the series to not have all Pokemon programmed and obtainable in the games. This sparked massive outrage that resulted in a movement called Bring Back National Dex, or BBND for short. This had Pokemon fans protesting in the hopes that the decision to exclude some Pokemon could be reversed, giving rise to a counter movement born out of spite called Don't Bring Back National Dex, or DBBND. The producers of the game reassured that this would grant them additional resources to fully flesh out the remaining Pokemon, and even allow them to focus on game balance, which has been a recurrent issue in the series. However, these words fell on deaf ears, as they did not reflect what was seen in-game. There were minimal, if any, improvements, especially considering the generational shift from a handheld console to a dedicated home console, the Switch, which has access to significantly more technological resources than any past Nintendo console. This is further exacerbated by the fact that Pokemon is the highest grossing media franchise on the planet. Time went by and eventually the games were released, and to everyone's surprise, it turned out that only 400 Pokemon made it into the final game, which is just under half of all the species. This was never officially announced. It was also revealed that the Pokemon assets, like the models and animations, were reused from the 3DS game. This means that a significant bulk of the work, being the Pokemon themselves, was far less demanding than what was required from past titles. This also means that Game Freak could pump these spare resources into other areas of the games. Did Game Freak take full advantage of this opportunity? Let's take a look. The game starts off a lot more cinematic than past titles, thanks to the hardware jump. It starts off in a huge stadium with a roaring crowd. Not all is well, however, as one of the glaring weaknesses of the game rears its ugly head early. There's no voice acting. This heavily detracts from the cinematic nature of the game. It's extremely distracting and shatters immersion as characters' lips move with no sound coming out of them. The beginning is especially jarring as Rose's movements pause between each sentence as he waits for you to make an input. The Legend of Zelda series recently introduced voice acting, which paid dividends for what little story that game had to offer. Even the mobile spin-off Pokemon title, Pokemon Masters, takes advantage of what voice acting has to offer. It fleshes out a character in a way that is not possible otherwise. Characters are very important when it comes to media, especially in the RPG genre, which is what Pokemon Sword and Shield are. Many of the cutscenes feel flat and lifeless as a result of the omission of voice acting. Leon also commands his Charizard to Dynamax, but then proceeds to Gigantamax, which sheds a light on the convolution of the mechanic as a whole, but we'll get to that in a bit. After the opening cinematic, the game plays out like it has for the past 2 decades. You are a kid in a small town, you have a mom, dad is absent, you have a rival, a professor, and you are given your very first Pokemon between a selection of fire, grass, or water. It's rather disappointing to see that Game Freak is still unwilling to shake up this formula in any significant way. The pace is also still extremely slow, especially for veteran players. Game Freak at least attempted to address this by allowing some tutorial skips like the Touch tutorial, which I admit is a much needed and appreciated addition. However, Game Freak fails to properly implement very basic quality of life features. One of the main criticisms of the last generation, Pokemon Sun and Moon, was that there was way too many cutscenes. On top of that, there was no way to skip any of them, which means you were forced to sit through every single one, every single time.
Get in the fucking bag!
Game Freak attempted to correct this by adding a skip cutscene option. This, unfortunately, has many flaws. First, as long as the option is on, it will auto-skip every single cinematic cutscene in the game, such as the one seen in the intro. Usually developers give you the option to skip cutscenes you want to skip. Game Freak makes the decision for you every time. Another issue is that you still can't skip the text-based cutscenes. The cinematic cutscenes can be skipped, but there's only a select handful of those in the entire game. The significantly more common cutscenes that want to be skipped cannot be. The same issue that plagued Sun and Moon Return to Sword and Shield. Speaking of cutscenes, the beginning of the game is completely filled with them. You are stopped by hop around almost every single corner. This slows the pace of the game to a crawl and is a serious drag. Hop, your rival, introduces you to his big brother Leon. He is Galar's very own unbeatable champion. Leon, as opposed to the region professor, is the one who gives you your first Pokemon, a first for the series. Hop picks the starter that is weak to yours, which makes him significantly less of a challenge, greatly contributing to the lack of difficulty present in the game. You meet Sonya, who is the regional professor's self-appointed assistant, and you eventually meet the professor herself, Magnolia. Magnolia introduces you to the main gimmick of the generation, Dynamax. An object conveniently falls from the sky at the perfect time and miraculously grants the ability to Dynamax. They're called wishing stars and can be used to Dynamax your Pokemon when retrofitted to a Dynamax band. A huge amount of power is just handed to you without the need to accomplish anything. It would have been more satisfying to earn the ability to Dynamax as opposed to receiving it as a handout. Leon then endorses you so that you can partake in the gym challenge. After you make it through the maze of cutscenes, you arrive to the wild area. In here you find dens where you can battle Dynamax Pokemon with up to 3 other trainers. You also find a wide assortment of Pokemon, some of which are extremely strong. You're physically incapable of capturing these Pokemon, however, as the game prevents it unless you have a certain number of badges. This removes almost all incentive to interact with the stronger Pokemon, since you can't capture them anyways. Instead of locking Pokemon behind badges, they should have allowed you to catch them whenever, but make them fail to obey you unless you have the correct number of badges. Similar to what happens when you get a strong traded Pokemon. This way you would have further incentive to interact with a larger array of species and would make the risk of running into the stronger monsters worth it, with the possibility of adding them to your team if you successfully catch them. Once you have your fun in the wild area, you have to head over to Motostoke in order to sign up as a contender for the gym challenge with the champion's endorsement. Once you pick a number and you get fully registered, your adventure truly starts. And unfortunately, it's not much of an adventure. The gym challenge is really your only priority throughout the entire game. Game Freak did a fantastic job with the gyms this time around, probably the best they've ever been, but that's all the game has to offer in terms of a plot. The actual plot is taken care of by Leon. You hear a large explosion in the distance and you want to investigate? Too bad. Leon, Galar's unbeatable champion, will take care of it for you. He does this several times throughout the game. Leon has a more interesting campaign run than you do. It made me wish I was playing as Leon instead of the player character. Leon is the true main character of Sword and Shield. I enjoy having the champion more involved with the story, but Leon is perhaps too involved, effectively sucking a majority of the fun out of the game. Most pieces of plot development arise through interactions with Sonya, although they leave a lot to be desired. You delve into a bit of lore, and you even learn that the true history of the region was hidden and altered. This is pretty interesting, and brings to light many questions like, why was the truth kept secret, and by who? You unfortunately never get any answers as the plot point is dropped almost as fast as it comes up. While Leon is busy playing the game for you, you instead proceed with your gym challenge until you get all 8 badges to be qualified for the Pokemon League. Instead of the Elite 4, this time around you participate in a tournament-style challenge, making your way through until you reach the championship match where you face off against Leon. Before that, you have to participate in an odd fetch quest to meet up with Leon, who went to Rose Tower for some mysterious reason. Once you reach Leon, he is having an important conversation with Chairman Rose. This is supposed to be a pivotal moment of the entire game, yet you are treated to still images with nothing but text. There's not even any music. The most bizarre thing I've ever seen. This was a great opportunity to learn more about Leon and Rose's characters, as well as fleshing out the story in an interesting and exciting way as we watch the climax of the plot unfold. Instead, you're left confused, especially with regards to Rose's motivation. To sum it up, apparently all energy in Galar will be exhausted in 1,000 years. There's literally no explanation for why this will be or what will cause this, or even if it's true or not. This makes it hard to understand what Rose is doing and why he feels so rushed to avert the tragedy, despite having hundreds of years to prepare for the worst. Leon refers to Rose's plan as madness, and rightfully so, wanting nothing to do with it. Leon is much more interested in the championship match with the player the following day. But Leon, being a stand-up guy, insists he will help Rose with his plans, but only after his anticipated match. This apparently wasn't a satisfying enough compromise for Rose because he proceeded with his plans regardless of Leon's wishes the following day, right before the championship match. Rose's plan is to bring back the Darkest Day, which was a prophecy we learned about earlier with Sonya. The Darkest Day was a storm that covered Galar about 3,000 years ago. It causes a leakage of Dynamax energy that forces Pokemon to Dynamax, but also has the unfortunate side effect of having the giant Pokemon go berserk. How is this supposed to alter the Galarian energy crisis that's alleged to occur within 1,000 years? Who knows? There were instances of wild Dynamax Pokemon going berserk earlier in the game. It's one of the many side quests that Leon did instead of you, once again having a more enjoyable adventure than the actual player. These events were apparently caused by Rose. Rose then says that his hand was forced by Leon to bring about the Darkest Day because Leon refused to listen. Except that Leon was actually willing to hear him out after the championship match was finished. All Rose had to do was wait a couple of hours and he would have had Leon's undivided attention. Rose also stated the energy for the Darkest Day was too much to continue, and he was in a pickle because of it. So not only is Rose extremely impatient, he's also incompetent. Dynamax energy begins to leak out around Galar. While Leon continues to play the game by handling the situation, you, the player, actually get to partake in the plot this time around. You start off by investigating the slumbering Weald in the search of the hero Pokemon that stopped the Darkest Day all those thousands of years ago. You obtain a relic of the Pokemon, but the Pokemon themselves are nowhere in sight. You head back to Hammerlock where Oleana, Rose's trusted secretary, begs for your help to stop Mr. Rose. She fears the underground power plant where Rose is located will collapse. She also informs you that Rose has awakened a Pokemon called Eternatus that emits energy that makes Dynamax impossible. What is Eternatus exactly? Where did it come from? And how did Rose get his hands on it? Many pressing questions. You head down to meet up with Rose where he claims that he needs to provide Galar with limitless energy to ensure everlasting prosperity, and for some reason, the Darkest Day was the only means to accomplish such a task. Rose has apparently been giving wishing stars to Eternatus. These are the objects that landed in your lap earlier on, and Bede, one of Rose's assistants, was tasked with collecting them for this very reason. It appears that Eternatus was encased in some kind of egg-like structure. Rose confesses the odd things happening around the region were a result of him trying to awaken Eternatus. So it seems he found Eternatus debilitated, and that's it. There's no explanation of where he found Eternatus, why it was asleep, why it was in the egg, how he knew where to find it, why it woke up suddenly, why he was unable to contain it. All of this vital information is just pushed to the side as you engage in an extremely easy battle versus Champion Rose. I literally one-shot every single one of his Pokemon. It was really pathetic. After you beat him, he claims he actually wanted to see the championship match and apologized for ruining everything. If that were truly the case, then he could have just postponed his nonsensical plan for a few minutes. Leon rushed to assist Rose by attempting to catch Eternatus. Again, it would have made more logical sense for Rose to simply wait for the match that he himself stated he wanted to bear witness in order to possibly obtain Leon's support without everything blowing up in his face. You move up to the roof where Leon is facing off against the mysterious Eternatus Pokemon, and to my surprise, fails to capture it. Leon so far has been established as, well, undefeatable and perfect in basically every way. He ran through any challenges that he came across up until this point. It probably doesn't help that he used a Pokeball of all things. A noob move for sure. The crappy Pokeball bursts open, because of course it does, and this somehow renders Leon unable to continue. The concussive force, I guess, took him out. Finally, now that the unbeatable champion is out of the way, it's the player's time to shine. After you clap Eternatus, he goes berserk and proceeds to Eternamax. That's right, there's a third form of the same thing, but we'll get to it. In the fight, you are prevented from using any Pokemon attacks due to a mysterious power, while Eternatus stands idle storing energy. Then Hob remembers that the two of you have the ancient hero relics, and proposes you use them in the hopes that it will magically do something. Turns out Hop was right, as the two items somehow awaken the legendary dogs from their slumber in the slumbering Weald, despite having no effects moments earlier. The dogs are also able to fly or teleport, and proceed to join both the player character and Hop right before Eternatus has the chance to decimate them. The two relics are randomly restored and brings the dogs to their true form. There's a pretty sweet transition from the cinematic to the battle, which I really appreciate. A raid-style fight commences with help from the legendary dogs, which renders the otherwise challenging battle mundane and spammy. Simply click the A button until his health is depleted. then throw any Pokeball as it will work like a Master Ball without fail. And that's it. Crisis averted and the world is saved. The dogs jump away and it cuts to black. Extremely underwhelming conclusion to an already underwhelming campaign. Nothing really happens from the first time you register for the gym challenge to the championship match against Leon. You come across some ruins here and there, and you have a few discussions with Sonya, and that's about it regarding the plot. The whole game is pretty much just the gym challenge with the world-threatening event tacked on at the end. As I said earlier, the gym challenge this time around is really amazing, the best it's ever been. But the gym challenge is always only supposed to be the B-plot, while the larger story unfolds in front of you. There really was no unfolding this time around, since Leon handles any obstacle and insists you stick to your measly gym challenge while he saves the world. The gym portion of the game doesn't have to be relegated to the B-plot, but that's just how Game Freak treats it. Sword and Shield are no exception. After you save the world, the championship match is rescheduled to 3 days later. I will admit that this was the most highly anticipated championship fight I've ever experienced in a Pokemon game, and I was actually quite nervous going in. This nervousness was mostly attributed to my self-made restrictions I placed upon myself in order to have a more enjoyable experience, but it was hyped nonetheless. I barely came out on top, and finally defeated the undefeatable, and then the game ends. I believe the campaign would have been significantly stronger if they just focused on the gym challenge aspect more by fleshing it out. I remember reading leaked plots before the game dropped, one of which stated that Leon was boosted up by sponsors, but was a cheater. He was winning matches that were rigged, and Rose had a part to play in that as well. This brief synopsis of a fake leak is infinitely more interesting than the tacked together plot that Game Freak went with. The player character is just a side character in the Galar quest, a second fiddle to Leon until he is conveniently incapacitated so that the player can take the wheel for once. They should have found excuses to write Leon out of the story to give the player the opportunity to play the game, but instead he sticks around having a champion time while you're relegated to the B-plot. Don't get me wrong, I like Leon as a champion, and the fight with him was very satisfying. Perhaps if they made Leon the player character instead, the game would have been more interesting. The post-game is pretty abysmal. You basically go on a bunch of sequential identical quests where you need to take down Dynamax Pokemon in certain gyms. There are two new antagonists, arguably the worst designed characters in the game, who proclaim to be the new kings of Galar. They run around wreaking havoc by mysteriously forcing Pokemon to Dynamax. Their plan is to bring Galar under control of the royal lineage once again. They will achieve this by exposing the true nature of the legendary dogs, by forcing Pokemon to Dynamax. Actually no, the plan was to bombard the dogs with Galar particles. But what are Galar particles? What do they do exactly? How do they work? Where did they get them from? How is it administered? No clue. It's alluded that Galar particles are how the brothers were able to force Pokemon to Dynamax. In a throwaway line by Piers, he claims those random Pokemon were little experiments. Maybe they were testing the functionality of their Galar particle emitting weapon? Not only is no such weapon mentioned or brought up ever, but how would Piers possibly know that was the case? To me it seems like their little experiments were nothing more than redundant fluff to artificially pad out the epilogue play duration. The whole fetch quest of going stadium to stadium is completely unrelated to the brothers' true goal of framing the legendary dogs of atrocities by making them go berserk. The twins confess that it was their ancestors who revised history, like hiding the dog statues behind the mural, in an attempt to take credit by obscuring the truth. This caused the royals of Galar to be lauded and revered as heroes, even though they are manipulative liars who, even to present day, are attempting to obtain that same faux reverence that they recently lost due to the uncovering of recent events. They managed to successfully bombard Zamazenta with Galar particles, causing it to go berserk. The player character is tasked with calming it down, which it then tries to jump hop. Zacian comes to the rescue and stops Zamazenta, who proceeds to run away. The player is then given the opportunity to battle and catch the box legend. After that, you head back to the woods to catch up with Hop for the final battle. For the very first time, your rival actually captures a box legend and then fights you with it, which I thought was pretty sweet. This is followed by some pretty wholesome dialogue with a decently satisfying conclusion to Hop's character arc. That's the entirety of the story for Sword and Shield. I'm giving the story portion of the game an okay rating. Mostly in part because the gym challenge aspect was actually really well done, while just about everything else was subpar at best. The main story lacks cohesion and the narrative surrounding it is extremely muddled. The climax feels contrived and forced. Rose's character is butchered to meet the needs of the plot. The player character's exclusion from many of the story's key events also greatly holds it back. The story in the epilogue is equally as confusing, with the sudden inclusion of Galar particles alongside confusing motivation from the main antagonist. This would have been a great opportunity to dive deeper into the history of Galar, but instead, the player character is subjected to random raid battles that accomplish nothing narrative or plot-wise. The antagonistic twins are also uninspired, extremely one-dimensional, uninteresting, and overall unlikable. With the plot out of the way, let's get into the characters. I will start off with Leon since I've talked about him a fair amount already. As I've mentioned before, he's the center of attention in the game, stealing the spotlight at every opportunity. I like Leon as a character. He's confident and sure of himself. He wants to do the right thing. He reaches out and helps others, including the player character and his little brother. He's also highly competent and entirely dependable. I wish there was more intimate interaction between Leon and Hop, as Hop has a rough time for a bit, which we will get into. Leon could have been the light in the darkness for Hop, but we didn't get a chance to see anything like that. Leon is just too overpowered for his own good. He's literally referred to as the unbeatable champion, which suggests that he can't lose. There's nothing the player could have done that Leon couldn't have done better. Some could argue the only reason the player was able to catch Eternatus was because Leon worn him down for us, and the only reason the player succeeded is because of the legendary dog's assistant. Before then, Leon steamrolled through any presented challenge, leaving the player with nothing to do but to continue the gym challenge. He's a pretty impressive champion through and through, and I thoroughly enjoy the battle with him. He never backs down from a challenge, no matter how hard, and even acknowledges that the player character added the strongest Pokemon to their party, which invokes excitement in him. He has a true champion's mentality. Hop is your rival. He's also extremely annoying, especially in the beginning. He makes up a majority of the text-based cutscenes and they cannot be skipped, which means he drags on, usually repeating the same thing, how he will be the best or other useless information. Hop is also one of the weakest rivals, simply because he chooses the starter weak to yours, so your first few initial encounters are trivialized. Hop does actually succeed in having a bit of an arc. Around near the halfway point, Hop starts to doubt himself and his capabilities when it comes to Pokemon training. He is challenged by Bede and proceeds to lose. Hop takes this loss extremely personal. Bede implants a seed of doubt that has Hop question his desires to become the best Pokemon trainer of all time. Hop is Leon's brother, which means he's the brother of the unbeatable champion. This places additional pressures onto Hop as he now has to meet high expectations placed onto him by his brother. He feels he needs to uphold the family name and or the honor in a sense. This is where I feel Leon needed to step in more to give his troubled little brother some much needed direction, to empower Hop and to reassure him that he doesn't need to satisfy any outstanding external expectations. He just needs to follow his own path. This would have been a great character defining moment for both Leon and Hop, and would have made Hop's arc a lot more satisfying in the end. After Hop loses to Bede, he goes on a pretty nasty losing streak. He continues to lose to the player character, which honestly made me feel pretty bad after every time I crushed him, as opposed to satisfied. He loses to gym leaders, he lost to Rose, he even lost to one of the weirdos in the epilogue. This forces him to take a step back to reevaluate his priorities and motivations, and he eventually comes to the conclusion that he's not fit to be a Pokemon trainer. Hop had an odd obsession with imitating his brother as much as possible in the hopes of being successful. When you fight Hop in the Pokemon League, he even has the exact same intro as Leon, which I thought was a pretty cool touch. But it's not enough to just copy someone else's style or strategy. You need to develop your own unique identity that complements you as a person. That's the lesson that Hop was trying to master throughout his own journey. Hop is able to jump out from his brother's massive shadow looming over him, and is able to carve out his own path, even if it's a different path from that of his brother and the player character. Sonya is the catalyst used whenever the plot needs to be driven forward. She offers almost all of the exposition in the game that has to do with the overarching main plot, and that's about it. You learn that she went on her own Pokemon adventure back in the day, and was even This does imply that the rivalry may have gone sour, which may be one of the reasons Sonya ended her gym challenge prematurely. Perhaps Leon was a love interest that fell for another girl? Or maybe Sonya just couldn't keep up. The old man's wife does mention that Leon never held back, even in practice matches. Maybe Leon was just too overwhelming for Sonya, but sadly left with only speculation as the relationship, both past and present, isn't explored in any meaningful way throughout the game, which is disappointing seeing as how there's a lot of potential interesting history between the two. Sonya's role deals that she wants to prove to everyone, including herself, that she's capable of great things, is competent, and has talent. She wants to unearth Galar's mysterious past in order to claim the finding of a lifetime to put her name on a pedestal. She yearns to elevate her social status, and fears she will grow old and withered without proving her worth. Sonya is actually a pretty dark and complex character underneath her bubbly exterior, even with the little bit that is revealed to us, which makes her wasted potential all the more frustrating. Magnolia steps down and Sonya supplants her, taking on the important role of regional professor. Sonya is the first character to assume this role during the campaign. This is a huge moment for Sonya, and is further complemented by a book that documents her many findings regarding the legend of Galar. She thanks the player character and Hop for helping her find her way, giving her insight into what she cherished and why. The 8 gym leaders are some of the more memorable ones of the game. This is thanks largely in part to their animations in-game, which are expressive and unique to each individual. That's right, the leaders actually have some high-quality animations. Stuff like Raihan snapping a selfie before he Gigantamaxes his Pokemon is just so awesome. It makes you imagine a scenario where he would post the image on social media after securing a fat W, and make you appreciate a character even more despite nothing like that being in the game itself. This is only possible because of the solid animations each trainer brings to the table. The lack of voice acting hurts for sure, and would have fleshed out each of them even more, and their involvement in the story is at an unfortunate bare minimum, which appears as the exception. Despite these shortcomings, these new gym leaders are a welcome addition to the series, and will personally remember most of them for years to come. Rose is arguably the worst villain introduced to the series, if you can even call him that. There have been some stinkers in the past titles for sure, with some really stupid ideas and plan execution, but at least you could understand the motivations behind those stupid ideas and terrible plans. Rose wants to save Galar by destroying it. It's not clear how flooding the region in Dynamax energy is somehow supposed to avert an energy crisis within 1,000 years. Not to mention that it has the unfortunate side effect of unleashing tons of giant, rampaging wild Pokemon, like something straight out of Attack on Titan. This has the opposite effect of what Rose is trying to accomplish. How did Rose even learn about alternatives? Where did he find it? Why was Rose in such a rush to fix a problem that has a window of 1,000 years? His plan is just so incredibly idiotic, and his motivations are contradicted by his actions. I was unable to suspend my disbelief enough to the point where I could believe that Rose had exhausted every alternative course of action and had no choice but to go with the one he went on. It feels more like Rose did what he did so that the stakes could be artificially increased in order for the campaign to have a grand conclusion, instead of having a character act organically of their own accord. Rose is nothing but a plot device, which is unfortunate because he was an interesting character up until the very end. He was established as a very charismatic, competent, and even brilliant man. Not only was he the chairman of the Gym Challenge, but he procured a monopoly on power distribution in Galar with his company, Macrocosm. He's no idiot, yet his actions at the end of the game suggest otherwise. When he wasn't acting as the chairman, he would go out in his hilarious civilian attire, donning a cap and shades with a pair of polka dot short shorts. This is in stark contrast to his more serious business-oriented suit. It makes him come across as more lax and confident. It's never really explained why he dressed this way, but it's funny regardless. He has an odd moment with Bede where he seems to forget who Bede is, despite taking Bede in at a young age and taking care of him. He's Bede's surrogate father. He gave Bede his very first Pokemon, and he even endorsed him for the Gym Challenge. It's established that Oleana asked Bede to collect Wisdom Stars for Rose in order to give to Eternatus to enact his Darkest Day plan, which is of the utmost priority and importance to him. He may not have explicitly given the order to Bede himself, most likely enlisting Oleana's help due to being too busy, but he at the very least knew about it, so it's extremely confusing how or why he would momentarily forget who Bede was. Perhaps Rose has some kind of underlying mental deficiency which might be attributed to the extreme lapse of rational judgment later on in the story, or maybe Rose simply doesn't care much about Bede and is just using him to obtain his ultimate objective. When Bede attempts to destroy the mural, Rose genuinely looks disappointed, which would suggest emotional investment on Rose's part in his relationship with Bede. Rose's fate is ambiguous. It's mentioned in a throwaway line that after the Eternatus event, he turned himself in. A flaccid end to a flaccid character. Speaking of Bede, he's one of the 3 rivals in the game. He's rude, arrogant, condescending, and cocky to the point of being narcissistic. Bede is actually one of the better characters in the game, as it's very satisfying to blow him up in battle. It's tragic when he is practically deleted from the story in the second half. He starts off as a giant asshole who has an endorsement even more prestigious than the unbeatable champion, the chairman himself. He's very full of himself, leading to him overestimating his abilities, which makes fighting against him and winning very satisfying. You learn early on that he's collecting wishing stars, although he doesn't specify why. The next time you see him, you know that he's more than just the chairman's endorsed seat. They have a history. And you also learn that a huge motivation for Bede is to assist the chairman in any way that he can. One can deduce that Bede is collecting wishing stars for the sake of the chairman. After you collect your 4th badge, you run into Bede again, who is trying to destroy a historical mural in order to, you guessed it, collect wishing stars to gain the chairman's favor. It's unclear how destroying the painted wall will somehow grant Bede the wishing stars he's looking for, as later on when the wall falls there are no wishing stars, just a pair of statues that slightly drives the overarching plot forward with some exposition from Sonya. It makes no sense why Bede would do this, and he pays an exorbitant price for doing something so reckless that would have yielded 0 wishing star net gain in the end anyways. Did Bede know that there was a holodeath section behind the mural, or were his actions simply a necessary convenience to drive the plot forward? I'm leaning towards the latter. After losing to the player character for the 3rd time in a row, he is confronted by Chairman Rose, who is disappointed in Bede and decides to revoke his endorsement, effectively disqualifying Bede from the Jin Challenge indefinitely. This is a devastating blow to Bede as a character. While his actions were questionable and selfish, completely disregarding the historical significance of the mural he was about to destroy, he was doing it to help the chairman. He is, however, crushed in battle, removed from the Jin Challenge, and worst of all, he disappoints the one person who has been driving Bede's motivations up to this point in the story. Bede should be beyond traumatized after this event, or so you would think. We run into Bede again shortly after, and he seems perfectly fine. In fact, he's motivated more than ever to continue helping the chairman, even though the chairman crushed his dreams. You have to give respect to Bede's resounding resilience and optimism, considering the dire circumstances. He's willing to approach the chairman to ask for a second chance until the gym leader Opal approaches him and he decides to go with her instead of helping the chairman, and then disappears from the game until the very end in the Pokemon League. When you chat with Bede in the Pokemon League, he admits that the chairman completely disowned him for making a single mistake, which no one really seemed to care about in the end anyway. He then goes into a bit of detail about his experiences with Opal. Bede is a different character, and I would argue a worse one. He went from being overly confident, sure of himself, and dismissive, to weak, diffident, and submissive. Literally all of his recent development was off-screen, so it doesn't feel earned, and you aren't as sympathetic and invested in Bede as a result. Before you fight Bede for the last time, he wagered that if he lost, he would retire. But when he loses, the crowd pleads for him to not retire, so he doesn't. Bede is always too easily influenced / manipulated by somebody else. And this doesn't change. He's first manipulated by Rose / Uliana, then by Opal, and then by complete randoms in the crowd. He never makes important decisions for himself throughout the entire game. He just does what others tell him to do, which is disappointing. He didn't decide to become the next fairy gym leader on his own, he was coaxed by those around him. His cockiness that made him surprisingly likable and charming is washed away in the end, and replaced with nothing that is as endearing or memorable, essentially killing the character. Marnie is the last of the 3 rivals, and is an extremely underwhelming, underdeveloped, and largely inconsequential for the entirety of the game. She doesn't really do anything, and she doesn't have much of a character to go off of. She's essentially an excuse to include Team Yell, who are equally as disposable and the worst evil team introduced to the series. Leaked rumors posited that Marnie was some kind of runaway princess who wanted to take down the evil and corrupt organization run by Rose. The actual Marnie comes nowhere near as intriguing as that premise. She's just a girl that's there, and remains that way from beginning to end. You don't really learn why she's doing the gym challenge other than to become champion for herself. And the only reason I can think of Team Yell following her around is because she's Pierce's sister. Pierce is the leader of Team Yell, so Team Yell is basically just a bunch of weirdos obsessed with their boss's sister. Oleana is just as wooden and hollow as Marnie. She's Rose's assistant, is always by his side, and that's it. She seems to have the capability to flip her typical indifferent demeanor into one filled with intense rage. Oleana's animations in her battle have more character than her entire inclusion throughout the story, which speaks volumes to how little she has to offer. Her sole motivations are directly tied to the chairman's, similar to how Bede was in the beginning. They should have fleshed her out by diving deeper into Macrocosmos, a large business conglomerate owned by Rose, whom she's the vice president of. They're very similar to Aether Foundation from Sun and Moon, but are way less significant to the overall story, and the player is only introduced to them in the end of the game where you fight off a bunch of them in order to reach Rose. Even though the Pokemon don't speak, a great amount of character can be derived from the designs, cries, and roles within the game. Speaking of the designs, they're really well done. In fact, my all-time favorite Pokemon ever comes from Gen 8. I also really appreciate all of the non-wild overworld Pokemon. The main allure of a Pokemon game is the Pokemon themselves, so seeing them sprawled out wherever you go is an an excellent way to immerse the player into the world of Pokemon. To conclude the characters, some had decent arcs, some were ruined, and others were planks of wood. The designs for the most part are solid, especially the Pokemon. Overall, the characters are okay. The music was one of the few things I was looking forward to before the game dropped, and I would say I wasn't disappointed, for the most part. There are some straight bangers like Oleana's battle theme, Marnie's battle theme, and Eternatus' first encounter theme. I could go on, honestly. Some otherwise great tracks I feel were ruined with the inclusion of the doggo vocals. I mean, I get it, the box legends are doggos, but the dog/wolf vocals clash and distract more than contribute to making the piece better. The music does a great job of establishing the tone and feel within a given area. The wild area has some tracks that capture that Breath of the Wild aesthetic with the comic piano. Bagpipes serve up that Scottish feel, which ties into the inspiration behind the region, the UK. One of the essential contributing factors to the success of the gym challenge is thanks mostly in part to the music. It captures that epic scale that made me fall in love with the older Pokemon console titles. The music for the gym leaders is dynamic, meaning it changes throughout the course of the battle. It starts off very energetic, which gets you pumped up and excited for the battle that is about to unfold. When one of your Pokemon faints, the music tones down in energy, and the main melody is drowned out by a roaring bass, which does a great job at heightening tension, knowing that you're closer to possibly losing. When you finally reach the gym leader's last remaining Pokemon, the music shifts again, slowly building up in tempo as the crowd erupts into a chant. This is followed up by the gym leader Dynamaxing their Pokemon, significantly increasing their power and threat level. This was amplified in my run due to denying my ability to use Dynamax, which means the gym leader was a genuine threat, forcing me to make the best plays I could in order to come out on top. All of this is why the gym aspect of this game is the best it has ever been. Game Freak succeeded in making the gym challenge feel like a real sport of Galar, and for that, I commend them. Overall, the music is good, and is one of the best parts of Sword and Shield hands down. Now let's get into the actual game itself. It plays just like any other Pokemon game and has all of the elements present in past titles, with a few tweaks here and there. You no longer need to hold a button to run, as the character moves how you would expect them to. Tilt a bit to walk, tilt all the way to run. This is a great addition and makes traversing the game more enjoyable without having to break your thumb in the process. This is a far cry from the other Switch Pokemon title, Let's Go, where movement felt very rigid as opposed to the smoothness present in Sword and Shield. A change that was introduced in Let's Go unfortunately found its way into Sword and Shield, and that is permanent experience share. In past titles, experience share was always optional in order to cater to different kinds of playstyles. Typically, if you wanted to make things easier, you would turn it on, and if you wanted a bit more of a challenge, you would turn it off. Pokemon has always lacked a basic difficulty setting, so turning off experience share was seen as hard mode. Game Freak has made the decision for the player this time around by forcing experience share to be on at all times for the entire party. This has detrimental consequences to the games. First of which, it makes the games mind-numbingly easy, trivializing every encounter and removing basically any incentive from training any of your other Pokemon, seeing as how the game does this for you. To avoid over-leveling due to the experience share, it forced me to speed through the game while avoiding anything that gave additional experience. This means that I was forced to skip many new features of the game like raid battles and Pokejobs to avoid over-leveling and lobotomizing the game in the process. I also avoided wild battles almost entirely which is unfortunate because overworld encounters is a nice addition they carried over from Let's Go that I never really got to play around with. Even foregoing these additional sources of experience, I still found myself over leveled during certain parts of the game. There is the option to box your entire team and just run around with a single Pokemon, but not only is this time consuming and tedious, you shouldn't be forced to jump through hoops that were not only not present in past titles, but placed there deliberately by the developers. That's called bad game design. In order to produce any semblance of challenge to circumvent the disastrous experience share system, I had to put in place some self-made restrictions, which were: 1. Remove Pokemon Center healing. The game, unfortunately, fully heals you around almost every corner regardless, but there was some nice resource management required, and taking care of my own Pokemon was surprisingly rewarding. 2. No Dynamax, which is the premier gimmick of this generation that I will get into shortly. 3. No items during battle. And 4. Set battle style. Thankfully, this option was still available as shift style breaks the game. These restrictions actually made the game enjoyable and challenging, especially with regards to the gym leaders and their Dynamax Pokemon. Game Freak's current design philosophy is to introduce a new battle gimmick each generation. First it was Mega Evolutions, a welcomed addition that breathed new life into some obscure and forgotten Pokemon. This was followed by Z moves, which were one-time use, terribly animated, super powerful attacks. The newest gimmick is Dynamax. I was unimpressed when it was first introduced since the Pokemon just get bigger, and my opinion has not really changed since then. The only good thing about Dynamax is that it makes the campaign more exhilarating and difficult, but only if you refuse to use the mechanic itself, which is ironic. That's the only thing I like about Dynamax. The mechanic itself is inherently broken, being banned from Smogon singles, banned in doubles, and even restricted in Ubers. A tier dedicated to the most broken things in the game. A testament to how absurdly powerful Dynamax actually is. This is because Dynamax makes the Pokemon extremely bulky by doubling its HP, making it almost impossible to one-shot said Pokemon, even with a 4x super effective attack. The Dynamax Pokemon is given access to Hyper Beam level attacks that cannot miss, that grant very beneficial bonus effects during the 3-turn duration of the power-up. Dynamax also makes some attacks outright fail, and the Pokemon cannot be removed from battle. This limits both strategy and counterplay when facing off against Dynamax. It can also be activated at any time with any Pokemon, which adds a surprise factor to the mechanic and makes it hard to play around. The Pokemon is also free to hold any item they wish. Dynamax has the ability to outright decide the result of the battle. Some Mega Evolutions were obscenely powerful as well, but it was limited to a select pool of Mons, and they had to sacrifice their health item. Dynamax has no such restrictions. I also find Dynamax unappealing because the Pokemon just gets bigger. Game Freak tried to address this with new Dynamax forms called Gigantamax, which is literally just giant Mega Evolutions, except almost every single Gigantamax form is extremely ugly, with very few exceptions. The only difference between Dynamax and Gigantamax is that Gigantamax grants a new form, it's limited to certain Pokemon, and their main stab gets a slight animation tweak with a different bonus effect, and that's it. There's a third transformation called Eternamax, but so far this is exclusive to Wild Eternatus. The mechanic as a whole is a confusing mess that gets stale pretty quickly, especially with regards to competitive battles. Each battle is decided by Dynamax as opposed to the player's skill. This makes the game feel more like a coin flip than a game of chess. Battles are focused more on Dynamax use than how the game is played. And finally, Dynamax trivializes every encounter in the main campaign if you do choose to use it, further contributing to the lack of challenge found in the game without self-made restrictions. Challenge is only derived from the player, not the developer, despite that being a developer's job, not the player's. Battles are still sluggish and slow, and feel virtually identical to their 3DS counterparts despite being on superior hardware with additional resources. Sword and Shield really do feel like a 3DS port a majority of the time. Temtem is a good example to show tiny tweaks that optimize performance and experience in battle. For example, instead of having status effects play one at a time, like in Sword and Shield, Temtem has them resolve at the same time. This may not seem like much, but it makes each encounter feel more responsive, concise, and speeds up interactions greatly. Other turn-based games, like Persona, allow you to fast-forward gameplay during battle, greatly speeding up the tempo of a fight if you so desire. Pokemon hasn't changed up the battle formula at all. It still plays exactly like it always has ever since the Game Boy days, making Sword and Shield feel dated and clunky. Majority of the animations are lacking. Some attacks not even animated at all. This is because every single animation for old Pokemon were reused from past titles, despite the removal of half of all species and the promise of enhanced expression. This is not to say that all of the Pokemon animations are terrible. There are some impressive ones like Powerball. The inconsistency in the quality of the animations is dumbfounding. I can't believe that Double Kick, a move not even animated, is in the same game as Pyro Ball, one of the best looking Pokemon attacks I've ever seen. Guess that's what happens when you shove a bunch of 6-year-old low quality animations from the 3DS into your Switch game without revising or updating them to be appropriate for the console. The models are also exactly the same, with only a select few Pokemon receiving minor tweaks. The Pokemon models are not properly scaled, and seem to retain their 3DS proportions despite now being on a home console, which supports the 3DS port aspect of the game. This is disappointing as one of the main draws of a console Pokemon title was having the opportunity to see Pokemon size relative to one another. Something that a Game Boy simply couldn't accomplish was demonstrated perfectly on home consoles. Sword and Shield fails to capture this magic. It's odd that Game Freak introduced a mechanic where the Pokemon are gigantic, but somehow failed to scale the regular Pokemon properly. This shows a lack of care and attention to detail that was captured in much older games. The only reason I can surmise to explain why the Pokemon retain their 3DS proportions is because Game Freak are obsessed with a particular camera angle. It's an angle that emulates the one used in the handheld games, showing the back of your Pokemon in front of the opposing Pokemon. This angle would not be possible if the Pokemon, say Wailord, came out, because they would be too large and it just wouldn't work from the specific perspective that Game Freak insists on retaining, despite not translating to 3D very well. Game Freak was fine with omitting this absurd and unnecessary design restriction when introducing Dynamax, as the camera pans out accordingly to fit the massive Pokemon into the frame. This is not an issue at all in other console titles due to a dynamic camera that pans all around the battlefield. Sword and Shield also have a dynamic camera, but it always defaults to the Game Boy perspective at the start of every turn. It's a neat homage to the Game Boy days, but it has some major repercussions to the actual game that just aren't worth it. One of the things missing from current Pokemon games that was present in past titles, with regards to the Pokemon themselves, is nuance. Old Pokemon always made a return, but each game they felt new and fresh due to an overhaul in assets. They would get new sprites, some of the sprites being animated depending on the generation. Some creatures were familiar, but they still felt new all the same. The shift to 3D makes development easier as the same assets can be repurposed for new titles, but at the cost of nuance. A large portion of Sword and Shield isn't new. It's stuff we've seen for the past 6 years, and this takes away a bit of the magic of the region, especially for the first real attempt at a Pokemon console title. The EMU feature from XY, or Refresh in Sun and Moon, returns for the 3rd time in Pokemon Camp, and overall it's a downgrade. You can no longer feed or even pet your Pokemon like you could in the past. Instead, you are given toys like this stick, which you wave around in your Pokemon's face until they're fed up and attacked, and a ball, which your Pokemon fetch and then bring back to you. Petting your Pokemon or feeding them by hand was a lot more personal and meaningful, and you were rewarded with some of the best animations in the series. The toy stripped this intimate experience and replaces it with a sterilized, watered down version that is less enjoyable. It's also prone to glitches and bugs, occasionally trapping Pokemon in infinite run cycle loops that they can't escape from, which completely shatters what little immersion that was gained. You can technically feed your Pokemon with the curry minigame, sort of. The Pokemon pretends to eat invisible curry while the player character eats the real stuff, which comes across as awkward and downright cruel. At least you're rewarded with a cute animation like in Pokemon EMU/Refresh. The curry minigame itself is like the Poppin' minigame from Gen 4. Just like with those games, the appeal of making curry with the minigame wears off pretty quickly. Pokemon Camp was another feature that I skipped entirely thanks to the mandatory experience share, in order to avoid gaining additional experience that would strip difficulty and therefore lower enjoyability of the game. The concept of the Wild Area is the series' first encounter with a controllable camera. It took the franchise over 20 years, but they finally managed to do it, and it's honestly not very impressive. The Wild Area is one of the worst looking locations in the entire game. The textures used here are terrible, like the infamous trees, and despite there now being overworld Pokemon in the game, the Wild Area, at times, feels lifeless and barren due to the short render distance